On September 11, 1777, the British Army of William Howe was successful in driving George Washington's Continental Army off the battlefield at Brandywine. Yet the fate of the rebel capital of Philadelphia remained uncertain. After briefly withdrawing across the Schuylkill River to regroup, Washington redeployed within Chester County in the hopes of drawing Howe into one more engagement. On September 16th, the so-called Battle of the Clouds fizzled out when a heavy rainstorm drenched both armies, but allowed the Americans to avoid entrapment by the British once more. Wanting to keep Howe second-guessing what lay around him, Washington instructed Brigadier General Anthony Wayne to position his division southwest of the British Army in the Great Valley of Chester County. Should Howe move to Philadelphia, Wayne could attempt and cut him off. Anthony Wayne was a native of the Great Valley, being born at the family estate of Waynesboro in 1745. While previous Waynes had a lineage in military service, this Wayne initially struck out on his own as a surveyor, mapping lands in Nova Scotia up for settlement after the French and Indian War. While having no formal training in warfare, Wayne nevertheless joined his local Committee of Public Safety as the American Revolution touched off. In the aftermath of Brandywine, Wayne impressed many of his peers in the Continental Army by using his division to cover the rest of the Army's retreat. His command was made up of 2 brigades of Pennsylvanians. The 2nd Brigade was entrusted to Colonel Richard Humpton, a former British officer hailing from Yorkshire. The 1st Brigade was commanded by Colonel Thomas Hartley, a Pennsylvania lawyer 15 years younger than Humpton. Their foray into the Great Valley would be supported by 4 light cannons and a supply train of approximately 20 wagons. The 2,200 soldiers under Wayne's authority were on the move by the night of September 18th, with a promise of reinforcement from some 2,000 Maryland militiamen under the care of Major General William Smallwood in the days to come. The following morning, Wayne positioned his men on the western outskirts of Tavern, where a large portion of the British Army lay. The Pennsylvanians were so close they could hear the revel of the enemy. When the British began to stir, Wayne chose to withdraw west of Paoli Tavern. Here he would make camp in 2 farm fields well concealed from the Lancaster Road by woods. A fence line which divided the properties of pro-rebel farmers Ezekiel Bowen and Cromwell Pierce would separate the 2 brigades into distinct encampments. Lacking tents to lighten their load, Wayne's men were instructed to build booths out of brush to shelter themselves from the elements. While destruction of private property was forbidden, Wayne ordered segments of the fences be neatly dismantled to allow movements between each brigade. Wayne believed a golden opportunity had arisen to destroy the British threat to Philadelphia. He wrote to Washington, imploring upon the commander-in-chief the benefit of coming to his position near Paoli. Unbeknownst to him, 2 elements were putting Wayne in danger. First, Washington was already preparing to move east, seeing a different avenue to catch Howe off guard. Second, the element of surprise Wayne believed to possess had already been lost, either by an intercepted message or a civilian informant. Howe now had an opportunity to potentially cause irreversible damage to the Continental Army. To handle the rebel menace to his rear, Howe turned to Major General Charles Gray. Gray had a lengthy career both in military and administration. He had served as an aide to some of Britain's most important leaders, including King George III himself. Yet it would be his assignment to neutralize Anthony Wayne's division that would come to define his legacy. To assist in this mission, Gray would have Captain John Andre as an aide to quickly form an assault column that was led by the 2nd Light Infantry, with the main body consisting of the 44th and 42nd Regiments in that order. A handful of the Queen's own light dragoons would screen their advance. Howe detached a 2nd column to support Gray, under the charge of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Musgrave. In all, thousands of British soldiers were on the march at dusk on September 20th toward Paoli. Military operations that occur at night are always high risk. While the darkness masks movements from the enemy, it also makes it difficult to identify friendly forces. As Gray and Musgrave advanced west in the night, the 2 columns lost contact with one another. While Gray followed the Swedsford Road, known it would eventually lead to the Lancaster Pike, Musgrave took alternate routes not well documented, walking his men right out of the fight to come. Gray was now approaching an enemy twice his size, yet stuck to his original plan. Gray had instructed his soldiers to keep their weapons unloaded as he intended to storm the enemy with bayonets. Gray planned for the muzzle flashes of the startled Pennsylvanians to be a beacon to pounce upon. If discipline was held, Gray could capture a whole division of the Continental Army without firing a shot. Not everyone was comfortable with this strategy. Major John Maitland, commander of the light infantry that night, directed to have his firearms loaded, and while Gray had a rough idea where the enemy may lay, he did not have the precise position. As their march progressed, any civilian encountered was put under guard and ordered to follow in line, giving the British fragments of intelligence, yet placing citizens of Chester County in harm's way. When Gray's column reached the Warren Tavern, they had been moving for several hours and were starting to get restless. Sources conflict over whom the general questioned at the tavern, but Gray eventually discovered that Wayne was encamped only a few hundred yards away. Discovering a small lane immediately east of the American camp, Gray commenced his assault at once. Throughout September 20th, Anthony Wayne had put his division in a holding pattern on the Bowen and Pierce Farms. There was uncertainty when Smallwood would show up in the area with the promised reinforcements. Wayne would later claim his plan was to wait for Smallwood to arrive and then move out at once, going as far to order his men to lay on their arms. Colonel Humpton, however, claims to never have received this information. In effect, that meant Gray was approaching a camp half alert while the others were at rest. The darkness did not give Gray absolute surprise, however. Wayne had instructed the camp to be guarded with a ring of pickets, which was already suspicious of enemy movements earlier that evening. These early reports Wayne scolded off, however. But as midnight approached, Lieutenant Edward Fitz Randolph of the 4th Pennsylvania heard and fired upon an unrecognized body of troops coming toward him. He had just fired the first shot of what would become known as the Paoli Massacre. The dragoons and the light infantry stormed the picket posts, cutting Lieutenant Randolph of sabers and bayonets, with injuries that include the loss of an eye. Wayne was awoken by this commotion and knew what it meant, that his position was compromised, and he needed to rally his division awake to evacuate. This he and his subordinates were initially successful in doing. The brigades formed into lines of march as the 4 artillery pieces were sent out of the farm fields first. However, one of the artillery carriages lost a wheel and became lodged in the narrow opening between fence lines, blocking the infantry's escape. More gunshots began ranging out as additional pickets on the eastern edge of the camp began spotting the British. The 1st Pennsylvania Regiment, the best prepared after being so quickly awoken, were ordered into the tree line to blunt the oncoming assault. They began firing volleys at silhouettes moving toward them, not realizing they were shooting at the remnants of their own pickets. The flashes from this friendly firefair made the 1st Pennsylvanian easily targeted by Gray. The general raced to the front, crying out, "Dash light infantry!" Maitland's men charged with the bayonet and quickly overwhelmed the 1st Pennsylvania, whose rifles lacked such a sharp instrument. No sooner did the remains of the 1st Pennsylvania break, the British smashed into the rear guard of Wayne's division. 2 platoons of the 7th Pennsylvania formed a battle line and managed to pour a volley that caused most of the British casualties that night. But the Redcoats were able to close the gap before another volley could harm them, cutting down half of the 7th. The 44th Foot were now on the battlefield and broke apart the rest of Hartley's brigade. Pennsylvanians began to rally around the fence that divided the 2 farms, but once more the flash of their muzzles only aided their enemy into finding targets in the dark. Soon, the chaos was given a macabre illumination by members of the 42nd Foot, who set fire to the brush booths. In several instances, the rebels refused to come out of their makeshift huts for fear of the British bayonet, compelling the 42nd Foot to set fire to the shelters with people still inside. With the British fully deployed, Gray's column now fully commenced in literally cutting apart Wayne's division. Many of the wounds found on the Pennsylvanians were a consequence of the 18-inch triangular bayonet affixed to the British brown bess. While British accounts deny atrocities being committed during the attack, American testimonies recall individuals being stabbed up to 13 times. In a desperate gasp for survival, several of the Pennsylvanians threw themselves into a chilled bog on the southeast edge of the encampment. One of the more surrealistic tales of survival from that night comes from Lieutenant Colonel Adam Hubley, commander of the 10th Pennsylvania Regiment. As the British overtook the fence line, Hubley became surrounded by a dragoon and 4 redcoats. After an awkward standoff, Hubley began chastising his captors for assaulting one of their own officers. Due to the darkness, his captors could not see through this ruse, and he ordered the dragoon to follow him. Hubley was thereby given safe passage by the dragoon to the road on the west edge of the camp, where the source of the bottleneck was occurring. These Pennsylvanians saw a British dragoon approaching and turned their muskets on him, Hubley demanding his surrender. The dragoon took off at a hail of bullets. After this crazy encounter, Hubley would organize a portion of those at the bottleneck to manhandle the disabled artillery piece from the road. Wayne attempted to cover the retreat of his division by placing the 4th Pennsylvania in the woods just north of the Pierce farm, but with the bottleneck now loose, the remains of his command fled back to the Lancaster Road. Efforts were made to try and rally elements of the division at Whitehorse Tavern. Lieutenant Colonel Hubley and the 10th Pennsylvania were amongst those to reorganize around the tavern and were met by a surprising welcome. The vanguard of General Smallwood's Maryland militia had just arrived in the Paoli area, but with the regulars so badly disorganized in the dead of night, there was little the militia could do. The British light infantry were hot on the tails of the Pennsylvanians, and seeing militia lined up like ducks in the road, they began to fire upon them. While this violated Gray's instructions, it was enough to cause many under Smallwood's command to take flight into the countryside. This fact was especially frustrating as just a year prior, Smallwood took pride in leading Maryland troops and covering the retreat of the whole Continental Army in the disastrous Battle of Long Island. Wayne would spend the early morning of September 21st salvaging his division while moving north up the Great Valley and away from Gray's reach. Had Musgrave been able to navigate Chester County's network of roads, the British may have been able to entrap their enemy. Nevertheless, Gray had succeeded in dispersing a key component of the Continental Army with demoralizing results. Howe ultimately made Washington move off their line on the Schuylkill River, allowing the British the ability to cross the waterway and march into Philadelphia, thus completing their victory established at Brandywine. Gray had established himself as one of the most reliable British field commanders. His brigade of regulars would be feared by the Continental Army for the rest of the Philadelphia campaign. His nighttime bayonet tactics would be duplicated just a year later, this time on the outskirts of New York City against a group of Continental Light Dragoons. The favorite of the bayonet earned Gray the nickname of No-Flint. For his accomplishments, he would be recalled back to England to be knighted into the Order of the Bath by King George III. But once knighted, Gray would never again return to the rebellious colonies, as the war had turned against Britain. Controversy still abounds over Wayne's culpability for the rout his division suffered. Immediately following the attack, himself and Colonel Humpton accused each other of failing to take proper care of the camp. In truth, the camp had been prepped for an evacuation and was guarded by a few pickets who engaged the enemy. Unfortunately, those pickets were neither equipped nor disciplined to engage in a fight with just bayonets. Paranoid by what other officers were saying about him, Wayne demanded a court-martial to prove his innocence. This would be but one of several court-martials that plagued the Continental Army through the latter days of 1777, with so many of Washington's line officers being accused of fault for the loss of Philadelphia. In the case of Wayne, he'd be acquitted of any blame for his actions at Paoli. The experience at Paoli was a learning lesson for Wayne, who would well remember the tactics Gray had employed against him. On the night of July 26, 1779, Wayne would have command of a group of 1,000 picked men, tasked with assailing a British outpost on the west bank of the Hudson River. Wayne's troops were instructed to assault with unloaded muskets and bayonets at the ready. A reversal of Paoli would follow, in which Wayne was successful in taking a British garrison in mere minutes, ultimately giving himself some form of closure over the Paoli Massacre. Wayne would go on to be recognized as one of the big names in American military history, becoming the senior officer of the U.S. Army in 1792. For those who lived through the American Revolution, the Paoli Massacre would be one of their most visceral memories. Civilians who lived in the countryside near Wayne's camp that September night were awoken by the cries of hundreds of men fleeing for their lives. When the sun rose over the Bowen and Pierce Farms, trails of blood stained the ground littered with singed booths and broken equipment. The local population set about giving the dead they found on the battlefield a proper burial. All told, there were interred 52 bodies along the fence line between the farms, with a final body discovered a week later. The residents in the area tried to get back to life as normal, but the newly established earthen mound was a constant reminder of the loss suffered during America's fight for independence. After 40 years, it was agreed the mass grave needed a proper marker. The local militia, known as the Republican Artillerists, whose ranks consisted of several War of 1812 veterans, mustered funds with the assistance of surviving Patriots to erect a small marble obelisk over the mass grave. The dedication transpired on September 20th, 1817, with over 400 militiamen on hand for the ceremony that was attended by the son of General Wayne. While the marble inscription is worn away, it remains standing over 2 centuries later. It's one of the oldest war memorials in the United States of America. For its significance in military history, the site of the Paoli Massacre became the muster grounds for local militia in multiple wars. As such, a portion of the battlefield remains preserved in the 21st century, with multiple war memorials to various conflicts. The most prominent being an 1877 granite obelisk that preserves the writing upon the original grave marker. While surrounded today by the sprawl of Philadelphia suburbia, the efforts by the Paoli Battlefield Preservation Fund keep these hallowed fields preserved. While no means comparable in scale to a Brandywine or Germantown, the scene of the Paoli Massacre is one of the most impactful in the American Revolution.